Uh, I am really excited to be able to welcome our guest rabbi for this week, who I've known most of my life without knowing I knew him, because he was the son of my rabbi when I was 3 years old in Jackson, Mississippi. And he is now the rabbi of Temple Beth Shalom in Vero Beach, Florida. Sorry, yes, Temple Beth Shalom, Vero Beach, Florida. So I'm really pleased to be able to welcome and grateful to Rabbi Michael Birnholz. Before I turn things over to him, let's just say the blessing for study together. So I'm going to share my screen, and if you'd like, you can unmute for a moment, and we'll join together in the blessing for study, and then away we go. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok v'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Eternal One, whose mitzvot bring holiness to our lives and who commands us to engage in, to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. And with that, I'll turn things right over to Rabbi Michael Birnholz.
Rabbi Streifer, thank you so much for that introduction. And like Rabbi Streifer, I probably will not sound like I was born and raised in Jackson, Mississippi. My dad was the rabbi there from 1973 to 1986. So just following the events of the civil rights movement, that's a whole nother discussion. But what a wonderful opportunity to be able to join with La Asok, to be able to do this teaching on Tikvah, on hope. And as we are going through, I did get to see some of the recording from last week, and the amount of discussion was really pretty incredible as you were discussing this value of hope of how do we bring this midah of tikvah into our world. And so I'm going to be presenting not a text on tikvah, but a way that we find tikvah of hope through text that I will be glad to share with you. Please feel free to leave your screens on. I will only be able to see so much on my screen. If you have a question, please feel free to use the chat. Please feel free to use the raised hand function. That allows me to see that you have a question and to be able to call on you. And as much as I'm going to teach, I'm also hoping to have some robust discussion with you. I did just post into the chat. There should be the ability now to see a PDF that I put into a Google Drive so that if you would like to see, it's not the presentation I'm about to show, but it's the texts from the presentation in a PDF format. So I hope that is helpful to you all. And the PDF or the presentation I'm going to show is coming to a screen near you in just a moment. So hopefully you all should be able to see that well. Looks like somebody else is in the waiting room, and I'm just expanding my screen so I can see everyone a little bit better. And giving myself the chat window so I can see you all. And then away we go. Are you all able to see that presentation? Wonderful. So I will tell you, I'm on the East Coast of Florida. If you would like to chat and tell me where folks are, it's always wonderful to see the width and breadth of the community that is with us. And I will tell you from early childhood, I've always been a big fan of MASH. I remember being in junior high and high school and watching the syndicated reruns of the show MASH while I was doing my homework. And it's such a powerful, incredible show. It, of course, is it was filmed in the 70s and 80s, but in fact, it is talking about the Korean War. It's not the setting so much that I bring it to you. It's kind of the end of the episodes. I've been watching reruns. The reruns are very much available on Hulu. You can watch it to your heart's content. But here is the scene, and I think I kind of been watching from the beginning. I think this is the first time it really caught my attention that what I'm going to teach about today occurred. So here it is. It's season 4, episode 13, called The Gun. And a colonel is in his Jeep. They're run off the road by a tank. They're brought to the MASH 4077, the surgical hospital, and he has a vintage gun with him. One of the surgeons, Colonel Frank Burns, he helps Radar Riley, who's the company clerk, to store the rifles, and he admires this gun. Of course, the gun then goes missing, and he's not sure what is going to happen with then, and the gun goes missing. Everybody in the audience knows that Major Burns, that Frank has the gun, but in the camp they assume that Radar has now taken it. If it's not found, he'll face 15 years in jail. Eventually, it comes out that the gun gets returned. In the process of returning the gun, Major Burns shoots himself accidentally in the foot. It's just a flesh wound, and they kind of live happily ever after. What happens at the end, though, in the last like 30 seconds of the show, is the reason I tell you. So you have this big dramatic moment. Will Major Burns return the gun? Will Radar end up going to jail? What's going to happen? It gets resolved. After that, we see these two scenes. You have Colonel Potter, who is the commanding officer, and he's talking to Radar Riley, the one who had originally been under suspicion for stealing the gun. They're walking through the camp, and Colonel Potter says, "Do you feel better, Radar?" Because Radar had been drinking because he's about to go to jail. And he says, "Except my hangover, sir. Everything's all jumpy and blurry." And Colonel Potter says, "I didn't have a drink, and I've got the same problem." And look at each other, and they realize what has happened, that they've swapped their glasses. They take off their glasses, they both smile at each other and walk on. It then shifts to the other surgeons, BJ and Hawkeye. They're playing chess. They're sitting outside their tent. They're playing chess. And Frank Burns walks out and he's limping because remember, he's grazed his foot with a bullet. And then BJ says, "What's the matter, Frank? Did you kick a brick under a derby or under a table?" I don't know, was the transcription. And Hawkeye, the other surgeon, says, "Well, maybe it's gout, all that rich food." And whoops, sorry, my apologies. And Frank says, "Oh, it's an old football injury," because he doesn't want anybody to know that he had the gun, even though everybody knows that he, in fact, had the gun. If you must know, it acts up once in a while. Hawkeye then just replies, "I wouldn't use a bandage, Frank. The powder burns will heal faster." Showing clearly he knows what's going on, even as Frank is denying it. And Frank says, "Well, of course they will. I know that powder burns." And then he realizes, wait a second, they're on to me. What are you implying? And Hawkeye's response is, "Nothing, Frank. It's just a shot in the dark." Using quite the pun there to poke at Frank a little bit more. So I share that with you because here the problem's been resolved. That's the last few seconds of the show. And what do you have? These two little moments of comedy that are just like these are, and you can even say it has chuckling, it has the laugh track at the end, that here the stress has been resolved, the drama has been released, and they just have these moments where they're either laughing at each other, laughing with each other, laughing at themselves, these really powerful kind of uplift at the very end of the show. And if you watch as it gets later, there's always this at the end of every episode of MASH. I shared this with you because, in fact, this is a Jewish value. As we study and read and experience something painful and sad, we want to see a path forward. In Judaism, life is challenging. And in fact, what do we study? We talk about lots of challenging situations, stories, experiences. What do we want? We want a hope of redemption. We might want to find a way to find strength to go through. And what do we want? This is called a nechemta. And you can see it here. It's the root has to do with consolation and with comfort. You'll see that root of nun chet mem repeated in a lot of ways. And so what we're looking is for a nechemta. And what a nechemta is it's a Jewish custom of adding a note of consolation at the conclusion of a particularly difficult passage. A nechemta is an uplift that happens right at the end. The Judaism does not, the sages, the rabbinic sages, don't want to end on a negative note. And so what do they want to do? They always find a way of having that laugh moment, that uplift, that hope, that seed of something more planted at the end. And so I'm bringing these questions forward now. My hope is that you'll look at them, think about them, and as we go through a couple of more examples of this in Jewish tradition, that you'll get a chance to think about some of these questions. And what I actually even do is I am going to put them into the chat. So if you want to see them in the chat, there they are in the chat. Do we want God to provide the nechemta? If we get to the midst of a challenging situation, do we want that nechemta to just appear like a rainbow in the midst of a storm? Can we find or witness these blessings, these uplifts, these silver linings, or do we want to initiate and create them ourselves? When we are faced with one of these really challenging, yes, Torah readings are, and Parshiot, all the Aliyot will very often have a nechemta, and Torah readings are like this. You'll see a couple of examples in just a moment. So the question is, do we look for and try to find the nechemta, or do we do our part to initiate it or create it ourselves? Do we plan for them? As we're in the midst of something that's challenging and hard, do we actually say, you know what, I'm going to plan so that at X time, I'm going to have a nechemta at the end of this? And do we work to find them? Should we, when we're in the midst of a challenging situation, should we be working really hard to look for them? Here's a different question. Is there a drawback to always looking for a silver lining at the end? Had that conversation with a lot of folks of somebody will be in a painful situation and they'll say, oh, but here's the silver lining, or let's look for the blessing in this. And the other person will say, and I think, Bob, you might be making the right face if I'm reading your intent, but people will say, wait a second, I'm in pain. Why do I need to find a blessing in this? Not every bad leads to something good. And then is there a time frame for feeling pain before we turn from a nechemta? Should we allow ourselves to grieve? Should we allow ourselves to understand what our injury is before we're immediately before we turn to find something positive in it? Okay, so Dennis is asking, there's a difference between finding positive for oneself, for someone else. Dennis, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's it's sometimes cruel to look at somebody who's in pain or suffering or grieving and cut to the chase and have them try to think about what could we learn from this? What could be the consolation here? What could be the silver lining? And when I go to Shiva, I'm not supposed to be the first one to talk to the mourner. I'm supposed to sit down and just be with them until they're ready to talk and talk about what they want to talk about. And I think we could broaden that, extend that to other situations.
Did you say cool or cruel?
I said cruel as in unkind.
Unkind. Okay, Sue? Or sorry, Susan. I've got a Stu and a Susan. Susan, go ahead.
Thank you. I think these things sometimes just happen. I've said in this group, in the Torah study group, that 2 years ago I broke my ankle and I was literally helpless at home. And someone I'd known from my synagogue for a long time came over practically every day and gave me the only food I wanted to eat, which was noodles, because I had some other complications. And as a result, we have become literally best intimate friends. And I didn't plan for that. I was in physical pain when that happened. So there's physical pain and there's emotional pain. And I think sometimes these things just happen and we realize that they have occurred.
And I think that last phrase you said, realize they occurred, that's the piece of the nechemta. How do we prime ourselves or make ourselves aware, conscious, when we do have those things, that uplift that happens or that silver lining that comes? Stu?
So I look at the first three questions discussion here, and I see they're related to perhaps an old school or more orthodox notion that God will provide. And, there's tons of old stories from the old days, and, things going wrong, don't worry about it, God will provide. And so there's a Jewish thought or a Jewish uh, um, understanding that no matter what happens, God will provide. And so that nechemta is there already as part of faith, as part of our understanding. In at least some sectors or some ages of our peoplehood. So we're asking question, is that what we want to happen when at the same time saying, well, this is kind of what we believe?
Well, yes. I mean, and when you say God, I'm open to all sorts of different theologies of God, whatever. We could have a whole discussion of what does it mean for God to provide. And of course, we have the Midrashim and the comments that God provided the ram in the thicket. That was one of the miracles that God planted into creation, or the ability for the donkey in the Bilam story to speak. And that's do we just wait for it to appear, or is that something we're supposed to, like they did, making sure that they wrote this in to MASH? They always wrote the nechemta in. Jean, or is it Jean or Anne? That must be Anne.
Yes. It just reminds me of this whole parsha we're reading this week with Joseph and his brothers, and all these bad things happen. And I think it's saying you have to have patience to see the whole picture. And he says, don't be angry because this was all for the good. So maybe that's the nechema. I don't know how
That
you.
is, and that is definitely a nechemta. And it's also one of those things that I read and sometimes I cringe that it's all for the good. One of the things I love to point out in terms of the nechemta is, what are we all doing? We're sitting here having a study session. Rabbi Streifer's in Toronto. I'm in Vero Beach, Florida, and there's 18 of us. Yes, hi to us. High number of people that are on this call, that we're all on Zoom. And before March of 2020, how many of you knew how to Zoom or would have gathered in a setting like this to do this? This feels on some level as a nechemta of the pandemic, but then I don't even know, I'm certainly not going to say the pandemic this is a blessing. Is this a blessing of the pandemic? It gets to be really challenging as we talk about this. Karen, I'm going to take your comment and then I'm going to go on to the next couple of texts.
Yeah, just in response to your question, is there a drawback to always looking for the silver lining? I think that we always or almost always need hope when we're in a difficult situation. But I think that the drawback is when we go straight to the nechemta without facing what exactly the difficult situation is. And I think that applies both to ourselves when we're in a tough spot. It could be grief, it could be mental illness, it could be physical illness, or for others. And so if we go straight to the nechemta, we are denying and not acknowledging the situation that we or others find themselves in.
And again, I'll go back to Dennis. Well, I think it was your comment. There's a difference between finding the nechemta yourself and pointing it out for another person. And again, it goes back. I go back and forth. Sometimes you need someone to point out that there is a nechemta. So I'm going to keep going here. And Susan said that I think we should not plan for silver linings. We should just be in the moment and not have expectations about the outcome. And yet it's interesting because the rabbis contrive, and I'll show you in just a moment, actually contrive nechemtas. They create them as we are going through. Aristotle said tragedy before comedy. And we are, Dennis, you added there that our tradition is one, and that says, don't just say, oh, there's a hungry person, let God provide for them. Well, God put you there to see the hungry person, you provide for them. So I'm going to keep going. This is an example. This is one of our colleagues, Liz Hirsch. I just put in a search for a nechemta and came up with this beautiful Devar Torah and on Korach. So this is now in the book of Numbers, and this is there was a rebellion against Moses and Aaron and the leaders of the people of Israel. Korach gathered the community against him at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The presence of the Eternal One appeared to the whole community. The Eternal spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Stand back, for this community I might annihilate them in an instant." Scarcely they had finished speaking these words when the ground opened up and swallowed them whole, right? So here, in a response to this challenge to authority, the ground opens up. Okay, they all went alive down to Sheol. That's the Jewish approximation of hell. More than one at a time, with all that belonged to them. The earth closed over them. They vanished in the midst of the congregation. And Rabbi Hirsch wrote, and still it gets worse. I'm not quoting. Trust me on this one. We know there are many ugly, different, challenging texts in our Torah. In settings like Torah study and one-on-one conversations, we have each other. We parse and we struggle with these difficult passages. We wrestle our texts for blessing, as Rabbi Rachel Adler likes to teach. But our Jewish tradition offers another way to respond. When we divide up our readings of Torah publicly and aloud for our scrolls into sections, the rabbis who set that structure did so in an intentional way. They never end on a verse like the ones we read above. Then they all went down the earth in a blazing hole. No, we don't end that way. Even as we skip over, ignore the verses exist, we always end on a positive note. Namely, in this set of verses I shared with you from an unseemly end of Korach and his followers, it takes 20 more verses to arrive at the nechemta, the uplift or neutral place in which to conclude the aliyah. God's presence returns to the Mishkan, our traveling sanctuary. We read Moses and Aaron approach the tent of meeting. I'm not about to say that Moses and Aaron connecting with God's presence cancels the verses that came before, with Korach and many others being swallowed up. That's not the job of a nechemta. The nechemta is not the mirror image of what came before. It's not a mountain peak to a valley of the shadow of death. It's a small uplift, moving forward a positive note. So before I'm gonna come back to your comment, Linda, I want to show one more example because I'm just watching our time as well. Because here's another really incredible example of a nechemta, and this one is constructed. So the clearest nechemta can be found at the end of Lamentations. The Megillah we read on Tisha B'Av, the ultimate day of ultimate Jewish loss and mourning. The last verse of Lamentations is, "For truly you have rejected us, bitterly raged against us." That's the way Lamentations ends. But the rabbis do something really incredible. What do they have us do? They say, don't end on that verse. Say that verse and then go repeat the next to last verse, which is this one. Hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kakedem. Return us to you, Eternal One. Let us come back. Renew our days as of old. So the rabbis see that end of Lamentations. They know what we're experiencing on Tisha B'Av, and they say, don't finish with the rage against us. Come back to the sense of renewal. And they actually repeat. They don't just end with the next to last one. They actually repeat it after that last verse. Again, another way of saying, how do we have uplift? Rabbi Streifer.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that the passage you were just showing us about, in Lamentations, that verse is probably familiar to all of us as well from two places, from the end of the Torah service, when we return the Torah to the Ark, and also from the High Holy Lay liturgy, where we say those words again, over and over again. And so it seems to me that in those places, the nechemta becomes actually a call to action. That, at the end of Lamentations, you say this verse in order to bring comfort at the end of a very challenging and painful book, which is remembering a challenging and painful event. But then when we take it into our liturgy, it actually becomes a call to action to us to act in certain ways so as to bring about an end. And so it seems to me then that nechemta has the possibility of becoming, of pushing us to action in the world that can then bring out a better outcome.
Yeah. So, and that's the thing. And I'm looking at Linda's comment of you do this for somebody else? When do you do this for somebody else? When do we do it for somebody else? And is it something you construct or that you let somebody or that you just kind of find naturally as you're going? So other kinds of comments, and somebody was seeing the idea play on chotem, which has to do with sealing or closing, which is kind of interesting. I don't know if that in fact works, but it's really interesting to see it. And yes, 10th of Tevet is one of our minor fast days. And Rabbi Strifer, I wonder if with high holidays and with the Torah service, I think that is a place of nechemta. We're putting the Torah away, and it might be sad to see the Torah go. We need that little bit of uplift at the end. And the same thing with high holy days. Here you're at Yom Kippur. You've been facing all of that loss, all of that challenge, all of that reflection. And we don't want to end up with God raging against us or us upset with ourselves. Here's the reminder that you can go back and you can close the day with that little bit of uplift of hope. And so thank you for giving me the opportunity to share that. There are other questions I'm happy to entertain or take, or any last words.
Thank you.
Let me take this opportunity to thank Rabbi Michael Birnholz for teaching us. This was really interesting. I knew about the concept of nechemta, but to think it through in this way was so fascinating and moving. We are off next week for the new year, and then back the following week. I'll be teaching, and I don't plan to get COVID this time, so I will be teaching. Again, thanks to Rabbi Birnholz, and I wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom, a Shabbat of peace this coming weekend, and a Happy New Year. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Excellent. And you, Karen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.